I take the point, but there is a surprising level of despair, I think. I do think that in the community, certainly in our country, about where things are heading. There is a sort of an awareness that perhaps we're headed into very dangerous waters. And it still surprises me, even if it doesn't surprise you, that there's not more pushback, more demand that consequences be spelled out, policy options be properly explored, that real issues are grappled with and solutions found.
There's a wonderful passage in 1984, my favourite actually, where Winston Smith goes into a pro-old pub and tries to engage an old man in conversation about the past. And he's trying to find out what life was like before the revolution. Of course, the old man is useless because he remembers nothing of any political significance at all and drones on. You may remember it about top hats and boat race night, and eventually Winston Smith gives up. And he thinks maybe we're like the ant, which can only see small things but not big things. Most people simply cannot see the size of the crisis which faces us, or in any way measure themselves in such a way that they think that they could influence it, so they just turn away from it.
Then where do you see the West in 10 to 15 years' time?
I can predict with great confidence decline and possibly collapse in general, but the exact timetable of it is beyond me. I don't know. It could survive. It could survive for 50 years. It could be over in 3. I have no idea how quickly these things will happen because they're subject to events which come often out of nowhere and suddenly destabilize, or non-events, things ceasing to happen which you might expect to happen for some years, and so postponing things. I don't know. 10 or 15 years could be the same as it is now. We could be living in caves. I just don't know.
So, Peter, hope. We all need hope.
Well, there's hope in eternity. That's where you have to look for it.
It's a message.
Temporal hope seems to me to be in short supply at the moment, and I would not try to purvey it.
So your message is very much one that we need individually to
If hope is what you want, don't look for it in politics. Politics is a false religion, almost a heresy anyway, it seems to me. And you won't find much hope in it. As I say, I don't think there's any reason to believe that out of politics anything good will come. We're much more likely to see more Trumps than we are to see any kind of saviours of the moral universe.
Well, I don't know that any of us can operate without hope. So I guess that amounts to a plea for people to think carefully about where they stand before their maker at a personal level.
Yeah, I should say so.
Do you think, as a matter of interest, that if sufficient people did return to their roots, we could find our way out of our cultural malaise?
I suppose it's possible. I can only say what I believe and have observed, that this seems to me to be unlikely. Even as I say it, I have to confess, yes, I might be wrong, and I also have to consider that possibly by saying it, I might make it less likely, but the fact is it is what I believe to be true. I think we've had it.
Well, to some extent, I'm almost looking for some hope or a bright light in this.
Well, don't come here for it. If you want hope, you've come to the wrong shop. I don't do temporal hope. I think the Christian civilization of the Anglosphere, particularly in my own country, is finished. I don't see any particular reason to believe it's any more likely to survive anywhere else either. But certainly in my own country, the one which I can claim to know better than others, it is done for. I think there's no reason to hope at all.
The thing that I'm driving at a little bit here, or seeking to unearth a bit, is that you do meet a lot of people who are very concerned. You do,
and I do. But that you meet them because you're like that, and because you're looking for them because they're looking for you. If you just set out into the world in general, you wouldn't find them there. They're not there.
Despite the fact that the figures show this enormous level of distrust, of disengagement,
distrust
of polarization.
Maybe, but it doesn't lead people to say, well, let's in that case revive the principles of the Christian religion.
I suppose
it impels them to vote for Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen.
Doesn't cause them to ask questions again, though? doesn't cause them to reflect, perhaps we are
I
headed
don't
in the wrong
think if
direction?
they do ask questions, they don't ask them of me. And if I answered them, they wouldn't like the answers. And what I do know from experience is when I attempt to answer these questions in people's minds, they reject the answers. That's why I've given up, because it seemed to me quite clear, absolutely essential for the reconstruction of civilization in the Anglosphere countries, that in all cases, actually, the ostensibly conservative political parties in them should be destroyed and replaced with genuinely conservative parties. No other arrangement could create any conceivable political hope. And when I put this forward for several years before the 2010 general election, when if the Conservative Party had lost properly, it would have been destroyed and we could have replaced it. The response I got was tribal. People preferred to stick to their tribal arrangements and to continue to vote for a party which despised them than to take any kind of radical action. What I was told in 2010 over and over again is, we've got to get Gordon Brown out. And I said, well, what does it matter whether Gordon Brown is in or out? David Cameron will be no different, realistically, in any major policy from Gordon Brown. Indeed, Gordon Brown might be a better bet. Gordon Brown is probably more hostile to European integration than David Cameron, if you're worried about that sort of thing. So it's just tribal thing. What would it matter to have 5 more years of a Labour government when, if you had a Conservative government, the actions of the government would be identical? Whereas if you got rid of the Conservative Party, we could build something which was genuinely conservative. As I said, in Britain today, you can't sack the government. However you vote, you'll get the same government, but you can sack the opposition. And the response to this was either incomprehension or hostility or just blankness. What is for certain is it didn't make any difference. That's the point when I gave up politics. I said there's no room for reason in universal suffrage, mass politics. Tribalism always trumps reason. Look at the people who get elected and just look at what happens. Look at what they swallow.
So given the nature of these intractable problems, and given that the evidence is quite overwhelming that they are real, they're not imaginary, they're not going to go away, no. Why is it then that we are unable to pull together enough for long enough to have a reasoned debate about any of this?
At some point, I mean, I'm an ex-Bolshevik, and this does 2 things for me. One, it means that I have a lot to be guilty about. Secondly, it gives me insights into the politics and nature of the modern left, which most people don't have. One of the things that I did when I was still a revolutionary socialist was try and prevent people from exercising freedom of speech and thought. It came naturally to me. It came naturally to me because I believed that what I thought and desired was so good that anybody who disagreed with me must, by their nature, be evil and be deserving of being silenced. And this is the problem. The general left-wing belief, which is held by the elites of most Western countries now, is also a belief in their own virtue. And if you believe very strongly in your own virtue, and your virtue is based, it's almost a caricature of justification by faith alone. You are a good person because you hold certain opinions. Therefore, if you hold other opinions, you're a bad person. And I think that makes dialogue pretty much impossible. If you think your opponent is bad, not just wrong, but bad, why should you listen to a word he says? Well, they don't.
Well, why is it then that we can't learn the lessons of history? It's not as if it's so very... You lived in Soviet Russia for a long time. You saw the outcomes of that sort of elitist view.
The left have learned the lessons of history to this extent. They understand that the Bolshevik attempt failed, that the Soviet experiment was a disaster. That hasn't cured them of wanting to create paradise on earth. They've just thought, how should we do it another way? Which is how we come to Antonio Gramsci, one of the first and most intelligent communists to understand that the Soviet experiment had failed as long ago as the 1920s. He realized that the civilized working classes of Western Europe were never going to swallow this sort of thing, that there had to be a huge cultural revolution before they ever would. And his ideas took root, particularly in the big Southern European communist parties, his own in Italy, in the final years of the Soviet Empire, and began to spread out beyond the communist parties themselves into the left in general, the ideas of cultural, moral, and social revolution, not by violent overthrow, not through dictatorship of the proletariat, not even through seizure or sequestration of industries and banks, but through the capture by the Long March through the institutions of the television studio and the university and the newspaper office and the publishing house and the school, so that after 30 or 40 years of that, you would control pretty much the public mind, and you would be able to get pretty much what you wanted. And it's clever, and you have to concede to these people some admiration for their endless determination, their deep belief in what they want, and their subtle and in many cases very clever organization to achieve it. It's been a very, very well exercised revolution, and they have learned from history. The one thing they haven't learned, which I wish they would learn, is that they're wrong. But they have learned how to be wrong better, and that is why we have to fear them so much.
So two questions immediately arise for me. Given that the great bulk of people are surprisingly sensible when it comes to not being misled by intelligentsia.
I would completely disagree with that. I think the great bulk of people are incredibly easily misled. I find it over and over again. People I like, people who might write to me one week and say, I really liked what you wrote. The next week we'll be sprouting some drivel about the Russian menace or whatever fashionable nonsense happens to have been fed to them by the media they trust. It's extraordinary how gullible people are.
I find that a very challenging thought as somebody from a country where we pride ourselves on our pragmatism and our ability to see through bull dust. We think we do. Now, you've been
well, of course, one of the great things about thinking that you see through it is that people who think that and who pride themselves on it are often the most fantastically gullible people of all.
Well, it's an interesting...
It takes some nerve not to run with the crowd. I mean, I'm not given particularly to self-praise. I know my faults better than most people. And thanks to an awful lot of YouTube, I also know what I look like. Vanity is difficult in my position. But one thing I will say is that I have, maybe it's an instinct I've had since childhood, probably a gift not given to me, not a thing that I can claim any credit for, but I will not run with crowds. But most people will, and they do, and they're happier that way.
Well, there's a point Jordan Peterson makes to his classes in Canada. He points out to people that statistically speaking, they might say that they would not have joined the Hitler Youth, but statistically speaking, they would have.
Yeah.
We would have. I would have, probably. But it does still concern me, particularly in my own country.
That you look at there were people who didn't. I mean,
very few.
Joachim Fest, I think, read this book called Not Me, mainly about his father saying, I'm not having this. But it was extremely hard not to do. And most people did it. And just as most people wouldn't have been in the French resistance if they'd been in France in 1942, they just wouldn't have done it.
Anyway, that was part one, as a sort of plea on behalf of people in the street. They need to be more conscious of what's happening. But the second part that I wanted to drill into there is, you're very, very bright people, at least we think we have, we taxpayers in universities. Why are there not more academics? You know, if wisdom is the ability to understand consequences and courage is the ability to point them out, why are there not more academics pushing back against some of these ideas which have proven not just disastrous in practice, but as you point out, in theory as well? They don't work in theory. Communism doesn't work in theory either.
Hang on a minute. We'll move on to communism in a minute, if I may, but you said that one of the quality you're looking for is an ability to understand consequences. You mustn't assume that academics are so selfless that the ultimate consequences of society, perhaps after they're dead, are more important to them than the immediate consequences for their careers. But if I were an academic, I think I would know, indeed, or if I were in broadcasting, I think I would know pretty quickly that if I didn't fit in with the general conformist view of these matters, then I couldn't expect to get tenure or to rise in my profession. And these things are ultimately possibly more important to people than the total coherence or indeed the ultimate consequences of the points of view they espouse. Anyway, anybody can fool himself into believing that his own position is going to lead to paradise.
Fundamentally, my question is, how do we reverse the long march through the institutions? And I've been listening to you very closely this Australian tour.
Yep.
Your talk at the Sydney Opera House, your talk with John Anderson and Dave Rubin,
Yep.
and your talk tonight as you finished. You talked about the individual, how it starts a chain reaction, and an
Yep.
amazing amount of good can come out of that.
Yep.
Is that all there is to it? Is that all we have to do as a Western society, or as a society in general, to reverse this thing that started in the mid-20th century? Is that what we have to do to
I
empower the
think so.
individual?
I mean, that doesn't eliminate the necessity of group, or social or group action, but that would be idiosyncratically determined. I want to start a scholarship fund for graduate students who would be willing to uphold the classical values of Western universities. And so maybe that's a 10-year project, and it's not precisely individual, right? There's a social element to it. I think there's tremendous potential for educating people online. It's the desire for, and this is another thing that makes me optimistic. I mean, let's assume that there's genuine value in the golden chain of conversation that constitutes the humanities, classically speaking, over the last 3,000 years. That there's genuine value in that. And the universities let it go. Well, the value is still there. All it means is that someone else can pick it up and go with it. And I think the value is there. So who knows what new forms of universities, so to speak, might emerge because of the new technologies we have. I mean, it's clear from the hunger that's being shown on YouTube and in podcasts that people have the stamina and the desire for long-form, complex philosophical communication. Well, who would have guessed that? Well, that's obviously an exploitable market, you know, and YouTube and podcasts can be used and are increasingly being used for that form. We're going to make, I hope, we want to set up a system that will monetize creators, educational creators. The first thing we'd like to do, this is our first plan, we think, is to make, so I've already got a list from a guy who runs a MBA program in the US called the Acton School, and he's put together a very nice list of 3,000 important, I don't know if it's that long, it's long, I haven't looked through the whole spreadsheet yet, but several thousand seminal events of the last 3,000 years, books, writings, and that sort of thing. I'd like to select 100 of them and then run a contest. It's like, we want 3-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute, and 1-hour videos on every one of these topics. Run a contest, and we'll have people rank order them for quality, put them on the net. Then look, if you're, whoever you are, anywhere in the world, you want a quick introduction to the 100 greatest ideas of civilization, you can do that in 300 minutes. You know, and I mean, it's going to be low resolution. It's just going to give you an overview, but man, it's a start, and I suspect that there'll be a huge market for that, strangely enough. So if people leave what's valuable behind, one of the rules that I considered writing in my next book was where responsibility has been abdicated, opportunity lurks. Right, that's a good rule, and it's also one that can really help you not be resentful. Because if you look around you, you see, oh my God, it is in my next book. I've written this chapter already. Well, if you look around you, you'll find that there are undone things, and you're annoyed about them. Not all of them, but there's a subset of things that haven't been done that annoy you, and maybe you take it personally. Maybe you blame other people for not doing them, and perhaps you have your justification for that. But it's very interesting that A, they annoy you, and B, that it's a particular subset of them that annoy you, right? Like it's targeted to you and your temperament. It's like, well, if something is broken that bothers you, maybe that's yours to fix. Because why else would it bother you? And then what's also cool about that, I think, is that well, maybe that's where you find the adventure in your life, because people think, well, what am I supposed to do with my life? It's like, well, is there something around you that's broken that bothers you? Well, yes, lots of things. Well, why don't you fix them? Or try to fix them? And it turns out that you can. You can at least try, and that makes you more competent, and then at least you can fix something. And then it turns out that, you can fix a lot more than you think. So there's lots of opportunity that's unexploited. And the universities, look, large, unwieldy organizations often rape their own brand, right? They build a reputation, and then they squander it, and then they're done. And if the universities squander the humanities, then they're done, because that's the universities. But that doesn't mean the humanities are done for. I don't think that conversation is killable. Certainly not by postmodern neo-Marxists of the intellectual sort that occupy the humanities at the moment. Have at her, guys. All it is destructive as far as I can tell. And so there's lots of ways around the problem. Now, whether the universities themselves can be reconstituted, the only thing I've been able to think of is to fund graduate students. Because if you fund the universities directly, I know in Australia you guys had this strange situation where there was $50 million set up.
The Ramsay Centre,
yeah,
yes.
the Ramsay Centre.
Yeah,
right,
that's the
right?
one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Good. No university would take it. Well, Jesus, you can't even make this stuff up. It's like, there's no such thing as Western civilization, It's like, not even if we give you $50 million? You got to admire that to some degree. It's so insane, though. It's like, well, there'll be other ways that money can be spent properly. Yeah, well, that was part of it. Yeah, well, as they say, you can't make this stuff up. But I don't think this conversation that's been going on for centuries is. There's no way that it's going to be killed. There's too much to it.
Do you mind if I rebut just with the words of Peter Hitchens? He
Sure.
was recently with, and thanks everyone, he was recently with John Anderson talking about these things.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you this question on
Yeah.
the program. We didn't get a chance. He said, I think we've had it. I think the West has pretty much had it.
Yeah.
Maybe me saying it delays it, but I think we've had enough.
Yeah.
And then I was going to ask you, how do we reverse the long march through the institutions?
Yeah,
Because
I think
to see a man
I
like
think
that,
we're just getting started, man.
yeah. So there's
Yeah.
the fight is on in a way.
I don't think it's just on. I think we're winning. I mean, if you look at the macroeconomic situation of the world, look, we're going through some kind of crisis of conscience in the West, and it's a deep one. And there's things that need to be set right. And maybe all the criticism needed to happen, because we have to get back down to the bottom. But God, the news on the world front is so positive. India has electrified almost all of its homes now. And the child mortality rate in Africa is now what it was in Europe in 1952. I mean, that's a bloody miracle. The fastest growing economies in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's because, they're no longer toying with absolutely insane communist ideas. So, and they have a pretty decent set of technological implements at hand. Now, there's more forest in the northern hemisphere than there was 100 years ago. There's a lot, if you look, and there's at least a dozen books that have been written on this topic. Many of them are on my website in the last year. If you look, for every piece of bad news, there's 3 or 4 pieces of amazing news. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have to be careful. We're going to have to be careful. But there are going to be things coming down the pipes in the next 10 years that we can't even begin to imagine. Like the AI people are making strides. They figured out how to use AI to understand protein folding the other day. People have been working on that for a long time, and the AI systems got it. And I know some of the people in Silicon Valley who are working on AI systems, and one of them, he thinks he can build a sophisticated AI computer. And he's built many computers. And he can double it in speed every 6 months for the next 10 years. So, and I'm hoping, we'll be wiser individuals. Hopefully we'll be able to manage this. But man, I think we're just getting started. So I'm not pessimistic.
Thanks, Jordan. Cheers.
So perhaps we conclude on the point that at a personal level, there can be real hope and it's worth pursuing. And as Jordan Peterson puts it, only when you sort yourself out can you really make a contribution to your fellow men anyway.
Yeah, but you know about the Shakers, interesting American sect,
Right.
who were admirable in many ways, though they wouldn't reproduce, so they could only expand by recruiting. And they became immensely successful in particularly the furniture that they made was so beautiful that they could command huge commercial prices for it. And they had a quite profound effect on American society. But as the society became more civilized under the influence of them and others in which they were, they vanished. There are none left. And the problem with Christianity is that it creates the possibility of trust and the rule of law. And therefore it creates the possibility of societies of immense wealth and comfort in which people believe they no longer need it.
Heaven on earth.
Well, perhaps not heaven on earth, but it's certainly a society in which the amount of pleasure immediately available to us all, and the postponement of death and discomfort, and the pushing back of disease, and the very high level of peace and security in a society governed by trust is such that people forget the principles which led them to this point in the first place.
So, plenty to think about. Thank you very much.
Afraid so.